In the early 3rd century, when the Roman Empire seemed unshakable and Christianity still young and vulnerable, a storm broke out that would test the courage of believers in a way few could imagine. In the year 202, the Emperor Septimius Severus unleashed a violent persecution against Christians. What began in Rome soon spread across the empire, and by the following year, it had reached North Africa. In the powerful city of Carthage, 5 catechumens, Christians still preparing for baptism, were arrested by order of the local governor, Minutus Timinianus. Their names were Revocatus and his fellow Slavi, Saturninus, Secundulus, and a young noblewoman named Perpetua. From the outside, they might have seemed ordinary citizens, but their circumstances made their arrest especially striking. Felicitas was 7 months pregnant. Perpetua was only 22 years old, recently married to a man of high social standing, and the mother of an infant still nursing at her breast. She came from a respected and comfortable family. She had parents who loved her, 2 living brothers, and memories of a 3rd brother, Dinocrates, who had died at about 7 years of age. This was not a group of hardened rebels. These were young believers, some slaves, some free, some from humble conditions, one from privilege, united by a faith they had not yet even formally received in baptism. Soon after their arrest, they were joined by likely the brother of Saturninus, and perhaps their instructor in the Christian faith. Unlike the others, Saturus had not been captured initially. He chose to surrender himself voluntarily, refusing to abandon those he had guided in belief. His decision speaks volumes. This was not merely loyalty to friends. It was loyalty to Christ. Perpetua's personal situation added a painful layer of drama to the unfolding events. Her father, elderly and still devoted to pagan beliefs, loved her more than all his other children. He could not understand why she would risk her life for a religion he did not share. His anguish would soon become one of the most moving elements of her story. Her mother, it appears, may have been Christian, and one of her brothers already shared her faith, while another was still a catechumen. The household itself was divided, a small reflection of the larger spiritual conflict spreading across the empire. Before being formally committed to prison, the young believers were kept under heavy guard in a private house. Even there, they began to taste the cost of discipleship. They were watched, restricted, pressured, and threatened. Yet instead of fear overwhelming them, something else began to grow, a deeper resolve. What makes this account so extraordinary is that much of what we know comes directly from Perpetua herself. She recorded her experiences up to the eve of her martyrdom, giving us not only the facts of persecution, but the voice of a young mother facing death with astonishing clarity. Imagine her situation. A noble woman with everything to lose, a nursing infant who still needed her, an aging father begging her to reconsider, a future that could be comfortable, respected, secure. And yet she stood firm. Around her were companions equally vulnerable, a pregnant slave, young catechumens, not yet baptized, a teacher who voluntarily chose chains rather than freedom without them. Social rank disappeared in the face of suffering. In prison, slave and noble woman shared the same fate. This was Christianity in its rawest form. No political power, no legal protection, no earthly advantage. Only faith. The persecution under Severus aimed to crush the growing church by targeting conversions. Catechumens were especially vulnerable because they had publicly committed themselves to Christ, but were not yet fully initiated. The message from Rome was clear: abandon this faith or face the consequences. But for Perpetua and her companions, faith was not an opinion to be discarded under pressure. It was identity. It was truth. It was worth more than life itself. Their imprisonment marked the beginning of a journey that would culminate in the arena, before crowds, before beasts, before the empire's power. Yet already, even before chains tightened and sentences were pronounced, the battle was being fought in quieter places, in family conversations, in inner resolve in the heart of a mother, torn between love for her child and fidelity to her Lord. And it is here that their story grips us, because this is not merely a tale of ancient cruelty. It is a story of ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances and choosing courage. A pregnant slave, a young mother, new converts, a voluntary companion, bound together by faith, stronger than fear. As the account continues, in Perpetua's own words, we see not only suffering, but visions, spiritual insight, and unshakable conviction. The persecution intended to silence them would instead immortalize them. Their chains became testimony, their prison became preparation. Their impending death became victory, and the church would remember their names forever. As the young catechumen Perpetua awaited her fate, the greatest battle she faced was not in the arena. It was in her own home. She and her companions were already in the hands of their persecutors. The machinery of the empire had begun to turn against them. Yet, before chains and darkness came something even more painful. The pleading of a father. Perpetua's father, elderly and still devoted to the pagan gods, loved her deeply, more than all his other children. His heart could not bear the thought of losing her. Driven by desperate affection, he made yet another attempt to break her resolve. He did not argue theology. He appealed to common sense, to family loyalty, to survival. But Perpetua answered him with calm, piercing clarity. Pointing to a simple vessel nearby, she asked him, "Can that object be called by any name other than what it is?" He replied, "No." Then she said the words that sealed her fate. "Neither can I call myself anything other than what I am, a Christian." It was not defiance. It was identity. At that word, Christian, her father lost control. In a burst of rage and anguish, he attacked her physically, striking her as if he would tear out her eyes. His violence sprang not from hatred, but from helpless despair. Yet even blows could not shake her. Seeing that she would not yield, he withdrew in confusion and frustration. She remained unbroken. Soon after this confrontation, Perpetua and her companions were granted a brief period of quiet. And in that sacred pause, they received baptism. It is difficult to overstate the significance of this moment. They had been arrested as catechumens, still awaiting initiation into the church. Now, standing on the threshold of martyrdom, they entered fully into the Christian life. As Perpetua rose from the waters, she felt an interior movement of the Holy Spirit. She did not pray for rescue. She did not pray for deliverance. She prayed for one thing only: patience under bodily suffering. Her focus had shifted entirely. She was no longer asking to escape pain, but to endure it faithfully. Shortly afterward, they were transferred to prison. Until then, Perpetua had never known what such a place was like. She came from comfort, from dignity, from social standing. Now she was thrust into darkness and horror. The prison was suffocating, cramped, filthy, stifling with heat. The crowd of inmates made the air thick and oppressive. The soldiers treated them harshly. It was her first direct encounter with the brutal underside of imperial power. But for Perpetua, the greatest torment was not the heat, nor the roughness, nor the darkness. It was her child. Her infant, still nursing, had not been brought to her. The thought of him hungry, searching for her, cut more deeply than chains ever could. A mother's heart was being tested in the cruelest way. Providence, however, provided some relief. Two compassionate deacons, Tertius and Pomponius, who assisted the imprisoned Christians, bribed the guards so that Perpetua and her companions might spend some hours in a more tolerable part of the prison. There, her nearly famished baby was brought to her. She took him into her arms and nursed him. Imagine the scene. A dim prison chamber, chains. Nearby, a young mother in bonds. An infant clinging to her. It was a moment suspended between earth and heaven. Tenderness in the midst of terror. After feeding him, she entrusted her child to her mother's care and encouraged her brother. She tried to strengthen them even as they were shaken by grief. Yet she herself was deeply moved by their sorrow. To see their tears was harder than facing her own death. And then, something remarkable happened. Within a few days, her anguish began to change. The place that had horrified her at first began to feel different. The prison did not grow cleaner. The air did not grow cooler. The threat did not disappear. But her heart changed. Her sorrow gave way to consolation. The darkness no longer seemed suffocating. The prison itself began to feel almost agreeable. How could this be? Because the external chains had been overshadowed by an interior freedom. Her identity as a Christian, the very word that had provoked her father's rage, now became her source of peace. She had surrendered everything: status, comfort, family approval, even the possibility of raising her child. And in that surrender, she found strength. The persecution aimed to break bodies, but it could not conquer conviction. It could imprison limbs, but it could not confine faith. In the shadows of that African prison, a young woman was becoming something far greater than a victim of Rome. She was becoming a martyr, and the story was only just beginning. As the days in prison passed, uncertainty hovered over Perpetua and her companions. Would their imprisonment end in release, or in the arena? Would Rome relent, or would they be called to seal their faith with blood? One day. Her brother approached her with a request that reveals how deeply those around her believed in her spiritual closeness to God. "Sister," he said, "I am persuaded that you are especially favored by heaven. Ask God to reveal to you whether this imprisonment will end in martyrdom or not, and tell me what he shows you." This was not flattery. It was faith. Her brother believed that God was near to her, that even in chains, she stood under divine favor. Perpetua answered him with remarkable confidence. She did not hesitate. She did not doubt. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will tell you." That night, she prayed, and heaven responded. In Erbision, she saw before her a golden ladder stretching from earth all the way to the heavens. It was magnified, radiant, luminous, a direct path from suffering to glory. But it was narrow, so narrow that only one person could climb at a time. This was no easy ascent. Along both sides of the ladder were fastened terrible instruments of iron swords, spears, hooks, blades, weapons ready to tear the flesh of anyone who climbed carelessly. The message was unmistakable. The path to heaven required vigilance. It required sacrifice. It required courage. A single misstep could mean pain, and at the foot of the ladder lay something even more terrifying. An enormous dragon guarded the entrance. Its purpose was clear: to terrify and drive back anyone who dared approach the ascent. The beast represented fear, doubt, persecution, the force that seeks to block the soul from rising toward God. Then she saw someone begin the climb. It was Ceteris, the same companion who had voluntarily surrendered himself to share imprisonment with the others. He had not been arrested with them. He chose chains rather than freedom without his fellow believers. Now, in the vision, he was the first to ascend, carefully, steadily. He climbed past the weapons and reached the summit. From above, he turned toward her and spoke. "Perpetua, I wait for you, but be careful lest the dragon bite you." The path was open, but danger remained. Perpetua did not shrink back. She did not tremble. "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ," she answered, "he shall not hurt me." At her approach, the dragon reacted, not with fury, bad wheat fear. As if subdued by the power of Christ's name, it gently lifted its head from beneath the ladder. And then came the decisive moment. Perpetua stepped forward and placed her foot upon the dragon's head. The image echoes ancient scripture. The promise that the serpent would be crushed beneath the faithful. It was an act not merely of defense, but of victory. Fear did not overcome her. She overcame fear. With that, she began the ascent. Step by step, she climbed past the blades, past the dangers, until she reached the top. And there, the scene changed. Before her stretched an immense garden, wide, radiant, filled with peace. At its center sat a tall figure dressed like a shepherd, his hair white, surrounded by countless people clothed in shining white garments. The symbolism is unmistakable. The shepherd evokes Christ, the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. The white garments signify the redeemed, those purified through suffering and faithfulness. The shepherd called her by name, not martyr, not prisoner, not condemned. He called her Perpetua. He welcomed her. Then, in a gesture both tender and symbolic, he gave her curds made from the milk he had drawn nourishment from his own flock. She received them with cupped hands and ate. It was communion. It was reward. It was participation in divine life. And as she ate, all those present in white cried out with one voice, "Amen." The sound echoed and she awoke. She found herself still chewing, as if tasting something sweet lingering in her mouth. The sweetness remained. When she told her brother the vision, its meaning was clear to both of them. The ladder, the dragon, the garden, the shepherd, all pointed in one direction. They would not be released. They would suffer death. But death was not the end. It was ascent. It was passage. It was victory. The dragon could terrify, but it could not triumph. The weapons could wound, but they could not prevent glory. The ladder was narrow and dangerous, but it led to the shepherd's embrace. This vision did not fill her with dread. It filled her with certainty. The prison walls remained. The threat of the arena loomed closer, but now she had seen beyond them. She knew the end of the story, and it was not defeat. It was heaven. As the days passed in prison, tension thickened in the air. A rumor began to circulate. The prisoners would soon be brought forward for examination. Judgment was approaching. The arena loomed nearer. When this news reached the city, Perpetua's father could no longer remain away. Overwhelmed with grief, he rushed to the prison. He was an old man now, his hair gray, his strength diminished, but his love for his daughter burned fiercely. From the moment of her arrest, he had fought desperately to save her. Now, sensing that time was running out, he made one final appeal. This was not the voice of anger as before. This was the voice of a broken heart. "Daughter," he pleaded, "have pity on my gray hairs. Have compassion on your father if I am still worthy to be called your father. I raised you. I brought you to this age. My love for you made me prefer you above all your brothers. Do not make me a reproach before men." He did not argue religion. He argued relationship. He urged her to think of her mother and her aunt. He reminded her of a child, that small infant who could not possibly survive without her. "Have compassion on your child," he cried, "who cannot live if you die." His words struck at every natural bond of affection. He begged her to abandon what he called obstinacy. He feared not only for her life, but for the disgrace he imagined would fall upon the entire family. "Not one of us," he said, "will dare open his lips again if anything happens to you." Then came the most heartbreaking gesture of all. He took her hands, those same hands that had once clung to him as a child, and kissed them. He threw himself at her feet. Through tears, he addressed her not as daughter, but as my lady. The dignity of fatherhood collapsed in a desperate supplication. Pride gave way to pleading. Authority bowed before love, and Perpetua watched it all. She was not made of stone. She was not untouched by his anguish. She confesses that her heart was pierced with sharp sorrow. Of all her family, he alone would not rejoice at her martyrdom. Others may have believed as she did, may have found consolation in her faith, but her father stood outside that hope. He could not see the ladder to heaven. He could not see the shepherd waiting. He could see only loss. This was the true crucible of her faith. Not the chains, not the darkness, not the future beasts of the arena, but the tears of her father. In that prison cell, two worlds collided. The world of blood ties and the world of spiritual conviction. She loved her father. She honored him. His pain wounded her deeply, yet she could not deny who she was. To renounce Christ would ease his sorrow, but betray her soul. To remain steadfast would secure eternal joy, but break his heart. And so she stood at the painful intersection between earthly love and heavenly loyalty. The persecution sought to frighten believers through threat of death, but Rome underestimated something deeper, the inner strength born of faith. The empire could pressure bodies, families could plead, society could threaten disgrace, but none of these could force her to call herself anything other than what she was, a Christian. In that moment her martyrdom had already begun, not in blood, but in sacrifice of the heart. The arena would soon witness her courage before a crowd. But here, in the quiet agony of her father's tears, we see the costs most clearly. She was not choosing death over life. She was choosing eternal truth over temporary comfort. She was choosing fidelity over fear. She was choosing Christ, even when it meant being misunderstood by the one who loved her most. And that choice would echo through history. After her father left the prison in anguish, Perpetua tried to steady her own heart. She had watched him weep. She had seen the desperation in his eyes. Yet even in that sorrow, her faith did not waver. She had told him gently, "Father, do not grieve. Nothing will happen except what pleases God. We are not at our own disposal." It was not defiance. It was surrender. But surrender to a higher will. The very next day, as she and the other prisoners were at dinner, the moment arrived. Without warning, a messenger burst in to summon them to examination. The hour they had anticipated and spiritually prepared for had come. Word spread quickly through the city. Curiosity, spectacle, and suspicion drew a vast crowd into the audience chamber. Public trials were not private affairs. They were theater. Faith would now be tested before watching eyes. The prisoners were led in and placed upon a raised scaffold before the judge Hilarion, who governed in place of the recently deceased proconsul. Authorities sat, robed before them, backed by the full power of Rome. One by one, the accused were questioned. One by one, they confessed boldly. Jesus Christ. There were no half answers, no evasions, no strategic compromises. Then it was Perpetua's turn. At that very moment, her father forced his way forward, this time carrying her infant in his arms. The sight must have pierced her deeply. The child who once nursed at her breast was now being held up as an argument against her faith. Her father pulled her aside, pleading again, but now with even greater urgency. He begged her not to be deaf to the misery she would bring upon that innocent life. The child had no voice, no choice, no protection but her. Then the judge himself joined the appeal. "What?" Hilarion exclaimed. "Will neither your father essay gray hairs, which you are about to plunge into sorrow, nor the tender innocence of this child, whom your death will leave an orphan, move you? Sacrifice for the prosperity of the emperor." It would have been so simple. A small offering of incense, a symbolic hestir, words spoken to preserve life. Rome did not demand her heart, only a ritual. Perpetua's answer was steady and brief. "I will not do it." The judge pressed further. "Are you then a Christian?" There it was, the defining question. "Yes," she answered. "I am." No long speech, no dramatic flourish, just identity. Her father, desperate, tried physically to pull her down from the scaffold, as though removing her from the platform might remove her from her decision. But Hilarion ordered him struck. A soldier beat him back with a stick. Perpetua later wrote that she felt that blow as though it had fallen on her own body. The pain of seeing her aged father beaten for loving her wounded her more than any threat to herself. Then the sentence came. They were condemned to be exposed to wild beasts. The crowd had its spectacle. The empire had made its point, and yet something astonishing happened next. The condemned returned to prison joyfully. Joyfully. Not because they loved suffering, not because they were blind to the horror ahead, but because their fate had been sealed in faithfulness. The uncertainty was over. The path was clear. Back in the prison cell, another concern pressed upon Perpetua's heart, her child. The infant had been accustomed to her breast. She immediately sent Pomponius, the deacon, to request that her father send the baby to her. But her father refused. Yet here, in the midst of brutality and grief, she records a quiet miracle of providence. The child no longer required nursing, and her milk did not cause her pain. In her understanding, God himself had removed his final physical bond, easing both mother and child for what lay ahead. Not all would make it to the arena. Secundulus, one of their companions, appears to have died in prison before the trial concluded, spared perhaps from the beasts, but still sealed in witness. Before pronouncing final sentence, Hilarion had already ordered others Satyras, Saturninus, and Revocatus to be scourged. Perpetua and her fellow martyr Felicitas were beaten across the face. The humiliation was deliberate. They were being prepared for public display. Their execution was scheduled not as a quiet punishment, but as entertainment. Part of the military games celebrating Geta, who had been elevated to Caesar by his father Septimius Severus, alongside his brother Caton. In Rome's design, their deaths would honor imperial power. In heaven's design, their witness would outlive empires. And so the young mother, the grieving daughter, the condemned prisoner waited not with panic, but with purpose. The beasts had not yet roared. The crowd had not yet shouted, but a confession had already echoed louder than the arena ever would. "I am a Christian," and history would remember it. In the days following her condemnation, as death in the arena drew closer, Perpetua and her companions turned increasingly to prayer. The prison walls were damp, the air heavy, the future terrifyingly certain, yet their spirits were fixed on God. It was during one of these moments of communal prayer that something unexpected stirred within her heart. Without forethought, without planning, she suddenly spoke the name Dinocrates. The sound of it startled her. She had not consciously thought of her little brother for some time. Dinocrates had died years earlier at the age of 7, taken by a disfiguring illness that left an ulcer on his face. His death had been a wound in the family, but in the intensity of persecution and imprisonment, his memory had not been at the forefront of her mind. Yet now, in prayer, his name rose spontaneously to her lips. In that instant, she felt a deep conviction. She must pray for him. A new kind of struggle began, not against Roman judges, not against beasts, but in intercession. With fervor and sighing, she poured herself out before God, pleading for the soul of her departed brother. That very night, heaven answered with a vision. She saw Dinocrates emerging from a dark place, a place crowded with many others. The atmosphere was oppressive, scorching, suffocating. He appeared pale and thirsty, his face still bearing the ulcer from which he had died. The detail was vivid, unmistakable. This was no symbolic blur. This was personal. Between them stretched a great distance, impassable, isolating. She could see him, but she could not reach him. Near him stood a vessel brimming with water. It was full abundant, yet its rim stood too high, towering above him like a statue. Though he strained to drink, he could not reach it. Water so close, relief within sight, yet inaccessible. The image pierced her heart. The thirst, the frustration, the helplessness, it grieved her profoundly. She awoke shaken, but not hopeless. From this vision, she understood that her brother was in suffering, and she believed something radical for her time, that prayer could make a difference. So she intensified her petitions. Day and night, with tears and persistence, she begged God for mercy on Dina. Her prison cell became a sanctuary of intercession. Even as she awaited her own violent death, her concern stretched beyond herself, beyond the present moment, into eternity. Then circumstances worsened. The prisoners were transferred to a darker, more oppressive part of the prison, a damp dungeon, as preparations were made for their execution during the festival honoring Geta. Their suffering increased physically. They were even placed in stocks, yet, amphitheatre, in chains. In discomfort, another vision came. She saw again the place that had once been dark, but it was no longer shadowed. It was luminous. Dinocrates appeared again, but transformed. His body was clean, his clothing bright. The ulcer that once marred his face was gone. In its place remained only a healed scar. And this time, he was not straining in thirst. He was refreshed. The vessel of water was now within his reach. He drank freely. Joy replaced anguish. Distance gave way to peace. Perpetua woke with certainty. Her brother had been relieved from his pain. This vision reveals something extraordinary about her character. While awaiting death, she was not consumed by fear for herself. Her heart expanded outward to family, to the departed, to unseen realities. Her faith was not passive resignation, but active love. In the midst of persecution, she believed in mercy. In the shadow of the arena, she prayed for the forgotten. In her chains, she wrestled for another's freedom. The empire believed it was stripping her of everything: liberty, motherhood, future. But in truth, her spiritual vision was widening. She was participating in a reality far greater than Roman power. And perhaps this is one of the most compelling dimensions of her story. The young mother condemned to beasts was also a sister interceding for a lost child, a believer trusting that God's justice was inseparable from his mercy. Her body was imprisoned. Her soul was not. And even before the gates of the arena opened, she had already witnessed another kind of victory, one unseen by crowds, but radiant in eternity. As the days passed and the hour of execution drew nearer, something unexpected happened inside the prison walls. Hudans, the officer in charge of the guards, began to observe the prisoners closely. He saw their peace. He witnessed their courage. He noticed something unusual about them, a dignity, a grace under suffering that was not natural. Convinced that God favored them with extraordinary gifts, he developed a deep respect for them. Because of this, He allowed many visitors to enter the prison so that the condemned Christians might encourage and strengthen one another. Even in chains, they were becoming a source of comfort to others. But outside the prison, grief was growing. On the day of the public games, the day when the crowds would gather and blood would flow, Perpetua's father came once more. He was no longer pleading with argument. He was undone with despair. He tore at his beard. He threw himself onto the ground. He cursed the weight of his years. His cries were not calculated persuasion. They were the raw sounds of a father watching his daughter slip beyond his reach. It was a spectacle more heartbreaking than any arena could stage. Perpetua later admitted that she was ready to die of sorrow simply from seeing him in such misery. His pain wounded her deeply. This was not a hardened fanatic detached from family love. She felt it intensely. Yet even this did not break her resolve. On the eve of the execution, when fear could have overwhelmed her, she received what would be her final recorded vision. She dreamed that Pomponius, the deacon, knocked urgently at the prison door. When she opened it, she saw him clothed in a radiant white robe embroidered with countless golden pomegranates, symbols of richness, abundance, perhaps even eternal life. "Perpetua," he said, "we are waiting for you. Come." He took her by the hand and led her over difficult, roque terrain as though guiding her through hardship itself, until they arrived at the center of the amphitheatre. There he reassured her, "Fear not." Then he left her, promising to return and share in her suffering. As she stood in the arena of her vision, she waited for the wild beasts. That was what she expected. That was what Rome had prepared. But instead of animals, a different opponent appeared. An ugly, threatening Egyptian stepped forward to fight her. Others gathered around him. The atmosphere shifted. This was no random brutality, it was combat. Immediately, a troop of beautiful young men declared themselves for her side. They anointed her with oil, like an athlete preparing for contest. This was no execution. This was a match. Then a towering figure appeared, magnificent in attire, holding a wand like a gladiatorial master. In his hand was a green branch adorned with golden apples, the prize of victory. He announced the terms clearly. If Perpetua defeated the Egyptian, the branch would be hers. If the Egyptian prevailed, he would kill her with the sword. The meaning was unmistakable. This was not about beasts. This was about conquest. The struggle that followed was long and fierce. It was not effortless. It was not symbolic pageantry. It was a real contest. But at last, she overcame him. She threw him down. She placed her foot upon his head, a powerful image of triumph over evil. The crowd erupted with applause. She then approached the master of the arena, who handed her the branch and kissed her, saying tenderly, "Peace be with you, my daughter." When she awoke, clarity settled upon her heart. She understood. She was not merely going to face animals. She was entering spiritual warfare. Her true enemy was not Rome, not judges, not crowds, not beasts. It was the devil. The Egyptian had been a symbol, the embodiment of the demonic forces behind persecution. Her coming death would not be defeat. It would be combat, and not only combat, victory. With this vision, fear lost its hold. The arena was no longer a place of humiliation. It had become a battleground where she would claim a crown. Shortly after recording this revelation, her written testimony ends, and what remains is extraordinary. A young mother, a grieving daughter, a prisoner awaiting execution, yet seeing herself not as a victim, but as a victor. The empire thought it was staging entertainment. Heaven was staging triumph. She would walk into the amphitheater not to be conquered, but to overcome. And with that final vision, her narrative closes, not in despair, but in peace. As the day of execution drew near, it was not only Perpetua who received heavenly reassurance. Sataras, their teacher in the faith and fellow prisoner, was also granted a vision, and he recorded it himself. In his vision, he and his companions were not dragged into an arena. They were led. A radiant angel appeared, bright and commanding, and conducted them upward into a place beyond suffering. The transition was not chaotic. It was guided. The one who led them did so with authority and peace. They arrived in a garden of extraordinary beauty. Lush, radiant, filled with life. It was no ordinary landscape, but a place of rest and glory. The air itself seemed alive with joy. There, they encountered familiar faces. They met fellow martyrs who had only recently died for the faith: Jacundus, Saturninus, and Artaxius, who had been burned alive, and Quintus, who had perished in prison. These were not shadowy spirits or distant figures. They were alive, joyful, whole. Death had not diminished them. Instead, it had ushered them into splendor. They spoke together, inquiring about other believers, sharing news of those who had endured persecution. The communion of saints was not broken by the grave. It continued, vibrant and aware. Then they were led further into a place even more magnificent. They entered a stately dwelling, shining with brilliance like the sun. The radiance was overwhelming, yet not blinding. It was a place of order, glory, and majesty. At each center they beheld the king of that glorious realm, surrounded by a multitude of joyful subjects. From this gathering arose a thunderous yet harmonious cry, voices layered upon voices in perfect unity. Holy, holy, holy. The sound was continuous, powerful, alive. Heaven was not silent. It was worship. In the midst of this overwhelming sight, Satyrus turned to Perpetua. He remembered her longings, her courage, her prayers. And he said to her gently, "You have here what you desired." Her answer revealed everything about her heart. "God be praised. I have more joy here than ever I had in the flesh." It was not resignation that had sustained her. It was hope. The joy awaiting her far surpassed the comforts she was surrendering. But the vision did not end there. As they departed from the garden, they encountered something unexpected. Not glory, but sorrow. At the gate stood two leaders from the Church of Carthage, Bishop Optatus and the priest Asp. Unlike the radiant martyrs, they appeared troubled and alone. A division had arisen between them, a dissension within the church. Seeing the martyrs, the two clergymen fell at their feet, pleading for reconciliation. Even from beyond earthly life, the unity of the church mattered deeply. Yet something striking happened. Instead of accepting honor, the martyrs lifted them up and said humbly, "Are you not our bishop? And you a priest of our Lord? It is our duty to prostrate ourselves before you, Evan." In glory they honored the offices of the church. Perpetua began speaking with them, perhaps urging peace, perhaps offering comfort. But suddenly angels intervened. They drove Optatus and Aspicius away, instructing them not to disturb the martyrs, but to reconcile with one another. The message was clear. Heaven does not ignore earthly divisions. Unity matters. Reconciliation matters. Holiness is not only martyrdom in the arena, it is charity within the church. This vision added another dimension to the story of these martyrs. They were not merely courageous individuals facing death. They were members of a living, eternal body, connected to those who had died, concerned for those still living, attentive even to the wounds within their community. The arena awaited them. But in Satyrus' vision, the outcome was already revealed. They were not walking toward destruction. They were being escorted into a kingdom. The garden, the radiant king, the cry of holy, 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 the fellowship of martyrs. The concern for unity, all of it painted a portrait of a victory far greater than Rome could comprehend. And as the prison doors would soon open for the final march to the amphitheatre, Satyrus and his companions carried within them a certainty. Beyond the beasts was a garden. Beyond the sword was a song. Beyond the arena stood a king. Satyrus' vision did not end simply with the splendor of heaven. It carried a message, one that reached back toward the struggling church on earth. In the radiant garden, after the angels had rebuked Bishop Optatus and the priest Aspicius for their division, it became clear that reconciliation was not optional. Even leaders of the church were accountable before heaven. Optatus, as bishop, was charged to heal the fractures within his flock. Unity was not a secondary matter. It was sacred. The angels, having spoken firmly, appeared ready to close the gates of the garden. Before the vision ended, Satyrus described one final detail. They saw many other brethren and martyrs there, and instead of feasting on earthly food, they were nourished by what he called an ineffable odor, a fragrance so sweet and satisfying that it filled and delighted them completely. It was sustenance beyond the senses. Heaven was not empty light. It was fullness, communion, joy. With this, Satyrus' vision concludes. The remainder of the story comes not from visions, but from witnesses. Those who saw the final days unfold in flesh and blood. One of their companions, Secundalis, never made it to the arena. God called him from this life while he was still in prison. Though he did not face the beasts publicly, he shared the same hope. His death was quiet, but not without meaning. Yet among them, another trial was unfolding. One deeply human, deeply physical, and urgent. Felicitas was 8 months pregnant. As the day of execution approached, her heart was heavy, not because she feared death, but because she feared delay. Roman law forbade the execution of a woman who had not yet delivered her child. If she did not give birth before the games, she would be spared temporarily, separated from her companions, for Sitho wait. To her, that was unbearable. She did not want to be left behind, while the others went ahead to what they called their common hope. The thought of remaining alone in prison while her brothers and sisters entered glory caused her deep anguish. Her companions shared her sorrow. They had suffered together. They had prayed together. They had seen visions together. The idea of leaving Felicitas behind pierced them. So they did what they had learned to do in every trial. They prayed. United, fervent, urgent prayer rose from the prison cell. They begged God to allow her to deliver the child before the day of the shows. And almost immediately, before the echoes of their petitions faded, Felicitas went into labor. The timing was astonishing. The pains were intense. Childbirth in prison, without comfort or care, under the shadow of impending execution. It was suffering layered upon suffering. She cried out under the force of the contractions. One of the guards, perhaps mocking, perhaps curious, said to her, "If you cannot bear this pain without crying out, what will you do when you are thrown to the wild beasts?" Her answer revealed the depth of her faith. "It is I who suffer what I now suffer, but then there will be another in me who will suffer for me, because I shall suffer for him." In that moment she distinguished between natural pain and redemptive witness. Childbirth was hers alone. The arena would be shared with Christ. Soon she gave birth to a daughter. In the midst of chains and blood and looming death, new life entered the world. A Christian woman stepped forward and took the child into her care, raising her as her own. The child would live, a living testimony to a mother who chose faithfulness over safety. Felicitas was no longer hindered. Her prayer had been answered. She would not be left behind. What unfolds in these final scenes is not merely the story of martyrs facing death. It is a tapestry of friendship, unity, intercession, reconciliation, and courage. It is the church under pressure, revealing its true substance. Heaven had shown them a garden. Earth now showed them suffering. Yet neither childbirth, nor chains, nor grief, nor mockery could separate them from the hope that had already been unveiled in vision. The gates of the arena were about to open, but they were not walking toward defeat. They were walking together. The long-awaited day had finally arrived, at the day of triumph for Saint Perpetua, Saint Felicitas, and their fellow martyrs. From the moment they left the prison, a radiant joy seemed to sparkle in their eyes and infuse every step they took. Perpetua walked with serene composure, her gaze modestly lowered, every gesture reflecting a deep, unshakable peace. A woman cherished by Jesus Christ. Felicitas, full of uncontainable excitement, followed close behind, while the men moved with quiet determination, their hearts alight with courage. At the gates of the amphitheatre, the guards, following custom, sought to adorn them in the ritual garments reserved for participants in pagan spectacles. Red mantles were offered to the men, symbols of the priests of Saturn, and fillets to the women, identifying them as priestesses of Ceres. But the martyrs refused these idolatrous ceremonies outright. Perpetua spoke for them all, declaring firmly that they had come freely, under the promise that nothing would be forced upon them against their faith. The tribune, perhaps sensing the divine courage in their stance, relented, allowing them to enter the arena dressed as they were, in their own simple garb. Once inside, Perpetua's voice rang out in song, a hymn of victory, a proclamation that she had already conquered. The men, Revocatus, Saturninus, and Satyrus, boldly addressed the gathered crowd, warning them of the inevitable judgments of God. Passing before the balcony of the presiding official, they spoke with fearless conviction. "You judge us in this world, but God will judge you in the next." Their courage ignited the anger of the crowd, and cries erupted demanding that the martyrs be scourged. The tribune granted their request, and each martyr received lashes from the arena hunters, yet they rejoiced, exulting in the honor of sharing in the sufferings of Christ himself. God, in his providence, granted each martyr the specific death they had long desired. In their private discussions before entering the arena, they had spoken of the kinds of martyrdom they wished to endure. Saturninus, embracing the most extreme form of suffering, declared he desired to face multiple beasts, a deliberate choice to magnify his share in Christ's passion. This was no ordinary display of courage. It was a living testament to faith, a scene where fear was transformed into joy, cruelty became a platform for witness, and imminent death became the ultimate act of love and devotion. The amphitheatre, meant to intimidate and terrify, instead became a stage for glory, a place where the martyrs' unwavering faith shone brighter than any sword or wild beast could ever threaten. Every step, every word, every lash was a testament to the power of steadfast belief. These Christians did not merely face death, they embraced it not as the end, but as the passage into eternal triumph, into the embrace of God they had longed for and glimpsed in vision. Their bravery echoed through the hearts of the crowd, leaving both awe and reflection in its wake, a story of courage, faith, and divine reward that would endure for centuries. The arena had become a stage of both terror and triumph, where the courage of the martyrs shone brighter than any fear. Satyrus and Felicitas, having already faced the deadly jaws of a leopard, were next thrown to the merciless paws of a bear. Satyrus, who dreaded bears above all else, secretly hoped that the leopard would claim his life swiftly, sparing him from a more agonizing fate. But divine providence intervened. When exposed to a wild boar, the beast turned violently upon its keeper, wounding him fatally, while Satyrus was dragged along unharmed, a shocking display of goddess protection and a vivid sign for all witnesses. Later, Satyrus was tied to a bridge near a bear, yet the creature remained in its lodge, refusing to attack, unscathed and yet determined. Satyrus seized the moment to encourage Put, the converted jailer who had aided the martyrs in secret. He spoke with calm authority and unshakable faith. "You see, I have not yet been hurt by any beast, as I have desired and foretold. Believe then steadfastly in Christ. I am going where you will see a leopard with one bite. Take away my life." His words were both prophecy and exhortation, meant to fortify the faith of those around him. Soon after, the leopard was released, and Satyrus faced it fully. Covered in blood from head to foot, he endured the attack with courage that astonished the spectators, who, in their ignorance, jeered and cried, "He is well baptized." Even in the midst of mortal pain, Satyrus remained mindful of his spiritual mission. A dipped Putin's ring in his own wound and returned it to him as a sacred token, a pledge to strengthen faith and remind him of the power of steadfast devotion. Satyrus then fell, triumphant. His earthly life ended, but his eternal glory assured. Thus, Satyrus went first to await Perpetua, in accordance with the vision she had once received, where the martyrs reunited in heavenly joy. Some historians, like Martyrdom, even suggest that this Pudens may be the same martyr later honored in Africa on April 29th, a testament to the enduring legacy of these witnesses. While Satyrus was enduring his final combat, Perpetua and Felicitas faced their own terrifying trial. They were brought into the arena and exposed to a wild cow, a deliberate choice meant to mock them as women. The crowd expected chaos, screams, humiliation. The beast charged. Perpetua was struck first. The force of the animal tossed her violently into the air, and she crashed down onto her back. The crowd roared, but what happened next stunned everyone. Instead of writhing in panic or crying out in despair, Perpetua calmly raised herself into a sitting position. Her clothing had been torn in the attack. Before thinking of her wounds, before reacting to pain, she gathered her garments around her to cover herself properly. Her concern was modesty, not suffering. Then, realizing her hair had come loose in the fall, she tied it up. In Roman culture, disheveled hair was a sign of mourning or defeat. She refused to appear broken. Even in the arena, even after being gored and thrown, she would not look conquered. Her dignity was intact. Looking around, she saw Felicitas lying injured from her own toss by the cow. Without hesitation, Perpetua went to her friend, helped her to her feet, and the two women stood side by side, wounded, yet unshaken, waiting for the next assault. But the crowd, strangely, began to cry out that it was enough. Perhaps even hardened spectators were shaken by what they had seen. The women were led to the gate called the Sana Vivaria, the place where those not yet killed by beasts were finished by the sword at the close of the games. There, Perpetua was met by Rusticus, a young catechumen who had been devoted to her, and something extraordinary happened. With genuine confusion, she asked, "When am I to be exposed to the cow?" She did not realize it had already happened. Only when she saw the marks on her body and the tears in her clothing did she understand that she had already endured the attack. She recognized Rusticus and began to grasp what had occurred. This mysterious detachment from pain would later move Augustine of Hippo to wonder and awe. Where was she when she was being torn by the beast? What vision held her so completely that she did not feel the wounds? What divine love carried her beyond herself? It was as though her soul had been so absorbed in God that her body's agony could not reach her. Yet she was not detached from those around her. Calling for her brother and Rusticus, she gave them her final exhortation. Stand firm in the faith. Love one another. Do not be scandalized by our sufferings. Even at the edge of death, she was shepherding others. Soon, all the martyrs were brought forward for the final act. But the crowd, still thirsty for spectacle, demanded that they be brought back into the center of the amphitheatre so they could clearly witness the final blows. Some of the martyrs rose willingly. They exchanged the kiss of peace, a final sign of unity and charity, and walked into the middle of the arena on their own feet. They would not be dragged. Others were executed where they stood, without protest or movement. Perpetua, however, fell into the hands of a young and inexperienced gladiator. He was trembling, perhaps unsettled by her calm, perhaps fearful before the crowd. His hand shook so badly that his first strikes were clumsy and shallow. Instead of dying swiftly, she suffered multiple wounds and lingered. It was a painful end. And yet, in that very weakness, her victory was complete. As St. Augustine would later proclaim, 2 women amid wild beasts and swords had conquered the devil in all his fury. Their martyrdom took place on the 7th of March in Carthage, a date preserved in the earliest Christian calendars. Their bodies were honored in the great church of Carthage in the centuries that followed. Year after year, their feast drew crowds not to mock them, but to venerate them. Their names were eventually inscribed into the very canon of the Mass, prayed at the altar across generations. What began as a Roman spectacle meant to terrify became a testimony that outlived the empire itself. The amphitheatre has long since fallen silent, but their courage still speaks. Their dignity still shines, and their triumph, once hidden beneath blood and dust, became eternal. As we close this powerful story of Perpetua Felicitas and their companions, remember, this wasn't just a moment in history. This was courage under pressure. This was faith under fire. This was love stronger than death. The arena tried to shame them. The beasts tried to break them. The swords tried to silence them, but their witness still speaks. If this story moved you, challenged you, or strengthened your faith, don't just scroll away. Sit with it. Ask yourself, what would my faith look like in the arena? What fears do I need to surrender? What compromise do I need to refuse? If you found this powerful, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs courage today, and subscribe for more stories of faith, sacrifice, and spiritual depth. Your support helps this channel continue to bring these forgotten yet life-changing stories to light. And until the next story, stand firm, love boldly, and never forget, the arena's temporary, but glory is eternal.